morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. This actually couldn't have been a more timely conversation with the debt limit literally on the floor tonight with permitting reform. So I want to get my notes up first. But I want to thank you so much for being here. I'm Jake Sherman, one of the founders of Punchbowl News. A big thank you to the American Petroleum Institute for partnering with us to make this conversation possible. A quick reminder, we'd love you to share about these conversations on social media. You can find Punchbowl News at punchbowl.news on all social media. We made sure we had all of those before we started the company. You could also sign up for our free morning newsletter at punchbowl.news. And now I'd like to welcome to the stage our panel. Paula Glover, the president of the Alliance to Save Energy. Jason Grubbett, the CEO of the American Clean Power Association. Sean McGarvey, the president of the North America's Building Trades Union. And Mike Summers, the president and CEO of the American Petroleum Institute. So, all right, so Mike, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to pick on you because you reminded me the other day that you always assumed permitting reform would end up in the debt ceiling, and here we are, the debt ceiling is on the floor today. So give us an overview of what this permitting reform does technically and what it'll do for the industry.
Great, thanks Jake, and thanks to Punchbowl for hosting this today. I'm really glad to be with everyone. This is a really important day where we're going to see the first major permitting reform that is going to occur in this country for over 30 years. The significance of this should not be understated. The NEPA reforms included in this bill, I think, could be a game changer, but it is only the first step. I think one of the things that you'll hear from the panel today is that this is truly just a first step in the process here, and we need to do more. And what we're hopeful is that the United States Senate and the United States House can get together and do more on this later down the road, hopefully in this Congress. But we should not understate how important this NEPA reform is. We did a study just last year that there's about $157 billion in backlog in terms of permits that are needed to get energy infrastructure projects done. That's just energy infrastructure projects. And with this new timeline that they put in place, we estimate that about $67 billion in projects could be completed with the new two-year timeline that they're putting in place. So we should not underestimate how important just this NEPA piece is. We have other priorities, and I know there are other priorities on this panel, but this could be a very significant change to our permitting process, and we might actually be able to get some things built. I'll give you a couple of examples. Vineyard Wind, Cape Wind, the Keystone XL pipeline, they were all held up because of NEPA delays. The fact that there are key examples of things that actually could get done when we put a 2-year time limit on is a very big deal for energy infrastructure.
Sean, talk about the unions and how you guys see it and what the benefit is to workers around the country.
Well, I go back to testifying before Portman McCaskill when they were trying to get some things done probably 10 years ago. So this is a major, major leap forward. When it comes to our members, almost every project that they work on is dependent on some kind of permitting, right, in order to get the project going. And it's when you're sitting in your city or your town, work's not very good, and the project is announced, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, that's going to be a $300, $400, $500 million project. I'm going to get a chance to go to work. You're telling your wife or your husband, hopefully I'm going to get on that project. And then it's years and years later, and the project didn't move. And then the investors pulled their money because they had to put their money to work someplace else. So it actually takes food off the table of my members. It hurts them terribly economically, cuts down on their overall income stream when we lose these jobs. So this will be exciting news when we can break it down to them what this actually means. It doesn't solve all the problems. As Mike said, there's still lots to be done, but this really advances the ball forward quite a bit where it's going to have an impact on my members' ability to go to work.
Jason, Paula, why don't you guys weigh in as well? Not at once, but separately.
I'm going to allow you.
That'd be impressive if you could do it at once.
Not to bury the lead, right? Like, we have an industry that's investing hundreds of billions of dollars in modernizing the energy system. So we also have a non-trivial interest in the full faith and credit of the United States, right? So it's actually a useful thing that we have reliable markets that are going to support this kind of growth. I obviously agree with Mike and Sean, and this is the best idea that hasn't happened, right? We've been talking about permit reform. The fact that permit reform was kind of the sail that brought debt ceiling forward says a lot about the politics. And so I think we feel really optimistic that there's more there. But they also left a lot on the table, right? They did the smart, easy stuff, which is what you should do when you're trying to get another bigger piece of legislation passed. But I think we clearly love when Mike is pumping offshore wind. We think there's a lot of need both for renewables, but also for pipes. And we're not going to have a modern energy future unless we have really significant changes in the way we deal with transmission and also pipes. So I think that the real work is still waiting for Congress.
And I think what I would add is, and it's interesting because I represent efficiency, so not necessarily one that you would think would be in this discussion. I think a lot of the conversation around permitting reform is about supply, right? We need to build things, we need to get more supply. I think I want to say that as you're taking on permitting reform, think about how you reduce demand at the same time. Because there's a lot that we can do to reduce demand. And to your point, while NEPA and fast tracking is going to help, we cannot ignore NIMBYism and think that every single project is just going to easily get built because we have permitting reform. That's actually not the reality of the day. And so all that we can do to reduce demand at the same time that we're building supply, I think those two things together is really what's most responsible.
Let's take a step back for a second. This was at the end of last Congress, and Mike, I'm going to pick on you again because I've known you since you were on the Hill, so you have a good sense of the politics of this. There was an agreement at the end of last Congress to get permitting reform done. The Manchin bill, which then became the Manchin Capito fight. What happened at the end of last Congress? Why didn't it work?
Yeah, look, I give Senator Manchin a lot of credit for the moment that we are here in today, because were it not for the fight that he put up at the end of the last Congress, we would not be talking about this today. I agree with Jason that this is kind of the big fight. The politics are finally aligned here. We've all been talking about this for over a decade, that we need to get permitting reform done, and we're finally at a moment where we're taking a big step forward in just these NEPA reforms. But I also will say the importance of getting the Mountain Valley Pipeline built as well, again, wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the great work of both Senator Capito and Senator Manchin. So I give them a lot of credit for putting that on the table. Unfortunately, what I worry about, Jake, is that there's a new precedent that's being set, where when we're going to get these big bills done, we actually it actually is going to require an act of Congress. So part of the Manchin effort last year with the Inflation Reduction Act, that we finally got an offshore lease sale for oil and gas, but that was because of an act of Congress, right? It took an act of Congress to do that. And now it's taking an act of Congress to get the Mountain Valley Pipeline done. That is not the position we should be in. We should have a regularized permitting process that allows these projects to be built in a timely manner. That's good for consumers, and it's certainly good for the American people.
But do these reforms of NEPA help regularize that in some way?
Absolutely it does, but it's just the first step.
Yeah.
I mean, it is one step in the process. We need to do something on the Clean Water Act. We need to do something on the judicial reform as well, in our view, because we get held up over and over again in the courts, even if we can get the permits done.
Paula and Jason, I wonder how your industries are reacting to the proposal writ large, and whether there are things that you think should be in there that are not, or shouldn't be in there that are.
I think for us at the Alliance, we probably haven't taken close enough a look to really tell you that we have a particular reaction to the proposal. But I think just broadly speaking, look, again, permitting reform is not necessarily something that we're going to be fighting on as an organization that focuses on efficiency. But what I will say is I think smart permitting is really necessary, right? We just can't continue to think that we're going to build. Electricity generation and demand is going to continue to go up. It just is. And unless we figure out how we reduce demand while at the same time that we increase supply and certainly make it far more diverse than it is today, this is a problem and discussion we're going to have in 10 years. It just is. And so we have to acknowledge that some of the basics around conservation are important, right? We have to be able to figure out how do we, across industry. So it's just not about it's about buildings, it's about transportation, it's about industry, it's about all of it. And there are lots of opportunities for us to increase our energy productivity, at the same time reduce energy burden, and get things built in a way that's timely and is going to allow us to be able to compete.
I'm going to totally agree with that and then go back to talking about supply. So 3 things missing: transmission, and transmission, right? And I think that the bigger picture here, which we have to recognize, is we're trying to kind of address a 21st century technology with a 20th century regulatory structure. I mean, this is fundamentally about federalism. This is about who gets to decide. And when we started using electricity, we thought about the local power company, right? We imagined that you'd have a power company, you'd put it next to the people, you had lots of kind of pretty short transmission lines, and all good. We now have a fundamentally different energy system. The energy system requires interstate transmission to protect the economy, to deal with regions when you had these superstorms, and we literally had people dying in the cold, right, in the United States of America. And fundamentally, the ability to move low-cost power to the people requires more transmission. And it's a question of who gets to decide, right? Mike mentioned the Clean Water Act. It's a federal preemption question. That's a state problem, right? The feds can't fix that without basically putting elbows in and telling the states that at a certain point you have to get out of the way. That's the same conversation we're having around transmission. And you can't, it's not gonna be all or nothing, right? The status quo fundamentally broken. We have not cited a single high-capacity interstate transmission line since 2005, when Congress said this is a national priority. So the current system is fundamentally broken. The idea that we're gonna kind of like federalize this and like Eisenhower, we're gonna bring back the superhighway, like that's not gonna work either. We're not gonna push states and regions out. So this idea of backstop authority, where states and regions get a pretty specific amount of time with some real criteria to act, with the understanding that if they don't, the federal government steps in. Like, I think that's probably the model that we're gonna move forwards, and it's probably gonna have to apply not just on wires, but on pipes too.
Sean, let's talk about workers for a second and how quickly you expect to see an impact here. I mean, what are you telling your members, and how are you thinking about how quickly people could start seeing jobs?
Well, they're already seeing jobs, right? We've had 3 major pieces of legislation, historic pieces of legislation, which, by the way, in my opinion, if it wasn't for the Biden administration passing bipartisan infrastructure, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Act, we wouldn't have gotten this reform in this budget deal that was put together. There would have been no need for it. We're finally at a place where all the warring parties have come to the table and said, you know what, this is important to us for different reasons. This is important to you. Just look who's on the stage here, right?
Right. Odd bedfellows, probably.
Right.
Not to us, but to the rest of you all.
So the fact of the matter is, for my members, they've already been going to work. Projects have already started, right? Through the CHIPS bill, through the infrastructure bill. The money is out there now. We're underway. What we're focused on now is building what we call the infrastructure generation, right? Where we're reaching into more rural communities, more urban communities, targeting populations, particularly women, communities of color, or veterans formerly incarcerated, and opening up our training infrastructure to bring them through pre-apprenticeship into registered apprenticeship and deploy them on these investments that have been made. So the effects of all this work that's been done is already happening. It's out there, and you hear a lot about labor shortage in the construction industry. In the construction industry, 50% of construction is single-family housing. We don't do much single-family housing.
Right.
So we're still in pretty good stead at pretty much almost to full employment in heavy industrial, commercial, institutional construction. But the pipeline that's in front of us of work is just phenomenal for the next 15 years. And that's what, we're already enjoying that. Now we're going to build our ranks and build a middle class through our training infrastructure.
Mike, let's talk about the Mountain Valley Pipeline. It sticks out because it's, as you noted, directly approved, preempted from legislation, from litigation effectively in this bill. Well, first, talk about why you think it's important. And second, it does have opposition from Tim Kaine, who has an amendment who wants to strike it out, saying it has nothing to do with the debt limit. Many things in this bill have nothing to do with the debt limit, so that's another issue altogether. But give us your sense on that.
Well, first of all, this is not an unprecedented act by the United States Congress. In the mid-1970s, Congress acted to build the Trans-Alaska Pipeline.
Yep.
So this has happened frequently in our history, when we designate an important infrastructure project and Congress acts to get it done. I mentioned the historic lease sale that we got because of an act of Congress. What I don't want to see is that this just become the precedent, because we shouldn't be in this place where Congress every couple of years has to authorize a bunch of energy projects because the permitting process is totally broken. One of the reasons why this is important is something that Paula said, which is that the world is going to continue to demand more energy, not less energy. In fact, IEA suggests that the world's going to be consuming 50% more energy in 2050 than it is today. Our kids are going to use more energy than we did. And what that means is that we're going to need more energy. And that means all of the above energy. But we're still going to need a lot of oil and gas. In fact, IEA also says that about 50% of our energy in 2050 is still going to be coming from oil and gas. So what we need to make sure is that we're building new energy sources as well. We need an all of the above energy policy, and Congress needs to work hand in glove with our industries to do it. We need workers to build the energy. We need cleaner energies, of course, but we also are going to need the fundamental baseload energy that the oil and gas industry continues to provide.
Paul, is there any concern? I'll give you a chance to respond to that if you'd like, but is there any concern that some of these provisions will unlock projects that are not necessary? Do you have concerns about that?
I mean, I think if regulators don't ask the right kinds of questions, that's actually what's going to happen.
Right.
So obviously, the reason that I want to be in this conversation is I want policymakers to be thinking about demand side as well as supply. But I want to just touch on something that Jason talked about when we talk about transmission, because I think he's right. There's this federal piece, but there's a state piece. And so also, my background is utilities, so we understand that at the state level, they make a lot of these decisions in terms of, you can permit all you want. But at the state level, are you going to get it built? That sometimes has to do with the legislature, it has to do with the PUC, and they have a different set of priorities. And so you can find that at a state level, state commission may say, we want 100% of net zero. That may make a pipeline project almost impossible to get built. And so understanding that the state dynamics do have a place in this kind of conversation.
Right, it's not just the federal government, right?
And then really understanding, I think, people. And so, I'm always saying, what is it that we are willing to sacrifice for this new transition that we want? Because we have to be reasonable about the idea that building transmission lines are hard because they are expensive, but also because people don't want to see them placed. The same with Cape Wind, the same with a lot of our big infrastructure projects. And so there is a lot of education that has to go on. And again, if we are able to reduce the number of those projects that we actually have to build, I think the ones then that are necessary get built easier, because people understand that we're using every single tool that we have to get us where we need to be and not picking a winner or a loser.
Well, here's the $1 trillion, so to speak, question. So we talked about transmission, how that needs to be dealt with in this Congress. I'd like to just go down the line and talk a little bit about transmission and also talk about the other things that are not in this bill. Like Mike said at the beginning, what does Congress need to do this year and what's doable this year? This might take another hour, but what is doable this year to achieve some of these things that you think were left out of this bill?
I mean, for me, I'm happy that we kept on to the clean energy credits, right? So that's what was most important.
And that was a question for a little bit.
Right. And so actually, I don't know that I'm asking for anything else. Can we just
You got your wish.
What
Okay,
we've got already invested in, IRA, investment in our buildings, investment in schools, all of that. If we can keep that, I think we're going to be happy.
I'll just kind of pick on that for a little bit, and this also, comes back to what Sean was saying about these various pieces of legislation. We switched from arguments about taxes and regulation to basically innovation and investment, right? It kind of happened quietly, and even though the IRA politics were incredibly partisan, the actual imagination of the future is now one that actually is what the country, I think, really comes together around, which is let's invest in modernity, let's get there fast. And so I think what we are struggling with now is just the speed and scale. Right? A lot of the climate advocacy community clearly wants that end point, but hasn't really metabolized what it means to rebuild the largest economy in the world in 26 years. And so I think what we're starting to see is that kind of conflict between the theory of that success and then the practical reality. We are all going to have to be part of this, right? Every single community is going to have some change, whether it's seeing a transmission line or taking out your binoculars and maybe being able to see a wind turbine off the very edge of the earth, or having a pipeline that's going to move through. Like, we're going to fundamentally have to rebuild the country really fast. My favorite blues singer, Howlin' Wolf, has a song, "I'm built for comfort, baby, I ain't built for speed." And that is essentially how we operate right now as a nation when it comes to building things. So this is the first little moment where there's enough alignment, enough shared sense of we all want the same idea of this future. We say all of the above. We're saying that with an open mind, not an empty mind. We kind of know what that means now, right? It means we have to maintain affordable energy for a dynamic economy and more of it. We've got to deal with our national security imperative, which is much more obvious to us since the war in Europe. And now we're all basically agreeing we've got to decarbonize the economy over the next generation. So with that kind of unspoken agreement, we now want to do stuff faster. To your question, we just can't get there with a balkanized grid system. And I think we also aren't going to create these superhighways. So the key is connecting these 8 or 10 different regions of the country with transmission lines. And the debate that happened, about 30% of the debate that happened, was about minimum transfer capacity. Can you require the different electric regions, which are controlled at the state and local level, to have some ability to move power back and forth between each other? So I think that's probably the step that came up in this debt ceiling deal that's going to continue to animate the discussion for the next couple of months.
Sean, I just want to say something you said backstage, what I think a lot of people feel, a lot of supporters of the president and supporters of congressional Democrats, which is last Congress was one of the most productive for middle class workers and the middle class broadly speaking in a generation. I mean, that's a lot. Last Congress was incredibly effective in getting things through. Now we have a divided government. I wonder how you kind of view that.
As long as they don't take us backwards, you know, we're okay. Speaking for my members and their families in the building trades, our expectations are not very high. We have a couple priorities. Permitting reform was our number one priority, so part of that's been achieved. I'd like to speak to what Michael was saying about, you know, on the demand side, and our children and our children's children. An interesting statistic I got a couple weeks ago is 2% of our electricity demand is eaten up by data centers. 2% of the electricity generated in the United States is being used by data centers. And I can tell you, we're building 15 or 20 data centers at a time everywhere across this country right now. So on the demand side, even if we do the efficiency work that we know we can do, in our you know 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States currently are coming out of existing office building stock, right? There's retrofits that can be done there, lots of tax credit programs that should help that. But the bottom line is we're in a situation right now where I believe, not since World War II, not since we won, the Allies won, people came home, it was time to build an economy, build a country, build a middle class. We're right in that same sweet spot. If we can get incremental reforms done that doesn't stun our growth as we go along, taking advantage of the new technologies, making sure we remain as the economic superpower in the world as we revamp this economy, we're just in a terrific spot if policymakers can just get along a little bit. And again, I'll give credit where credit is due. Speaker McCarthy, in a difficult set of circumstances, was able to work out a deal with President Biden. President Biden, I seen an old clip of him from back in 2019 when a reporter asked him, how do you think you're going to be able to do anything bipartisan if you ever achieve your goal of being president? And he says, there's no other way to get anything done. And chuckles went up in the room. Well, the facts say that he's been pretty damn effective over the first 2.5 years of his presidency in the big things that got done and getting them done bipartisanly. So, I think the opportunities are there. I'm not optimistic that there's going to be another big, especially with the way the budget deal is structured. We're supposedly not going to have an omnibus where something is going to get put in at the end of the year. It's going to have to be done through appropriations. So this is a good step. But again, I believe that, strange bedfellows, as you said before, all have wants, needs, and desires for things that they've been working on for decades, right, that bring them together, which should help policymakers move in the right direction and get some more of the things that we need done.
So API's priorities going forward, you're just going to shut down for the rest of the Congress?
That's funny. So Jason quoted a song. I'll quote my favorite, Elvis Presley. We need a little less conversation and a lot more action. And I think that is our challenge to the United States Congress, is to really focus on the action that is ahead of them. And I actually have a lot of faith in the people's focus on permitting reform right now. We have great leaders in the United States Senate, like Senator Barrasso and Senator Capito and Senator Carper, who I think would like to see this as a legacy issue, and Senator Manchin, of course, who've made this a real priority. So I think we have a real chance, and we have a willing group of House members, I think, as well, led by Garrett Graves, who, again, I don't think we would be here today if it weren't for the work that he put in negotiating this deal. So I do think that there's a real opportunity. The key point that I want to make, though, is that the things that actually endure in this country, the things that actually last past presidents, are the things that are done on a bipartisan basis. I mean, you can very easily see that if Republicans were to sweep in 2024, that the next Republican reconciliation bill is going to be filled with all the stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act, right? To repeal that stuff to save money. So the point is that if we really want enduring reform, it has to be done on a bipartisan basis. I'll give you one example of how that happened when I was part of the governance within the United States. So right at the end of my time with Speaker Boehner, we were able to lift the crude oil export ban. No one really paid attention to this. And the Republicans were pushing lifting the crude oil export ban, which was put in place by President Carter in the late 1970s. And as a consequence of that, we also were able to extend some of the solar and wind tax credits. That was the compromise. Kind of a minor thing, nobody really paid attention. Lifting the crude oil export ban opened markets to American crude oil overseas. We just did a study last year. It suggests that we produce about 2.5 million barrels more a day as a consequence of those markets opening. Again, imagine the scenario we would be in today if we were only producing 9 million barrels of oil a day rather than 12 million barrels of oil a day. It was because of us lifting that crude oil export ban. No one talks about reimposing that right now. What we're talking about is how we continue to expand and grow the amount of energy that the United States is producing. That small little acorn that we planted in 2015 has grown into a giant oak tree. That's I think the promise of permitting reform, if we get it right and if we do it on a bipartisan basis.
So let's do a quick lightning round. What does the world look like in 5 years, given this piece of legislation? What are the impacts? What are the short? I mean, that's a medium-term effect.
In the last 9 months, there have been over $180 billion invested in new clean energy technologies, right? We've had over 50 domestic manufacturing facilities just in the last 9 months. We're moving about a third as fast as we actually need to achieve the security and the environmental economic goals in the next 25 years, right? So 5 years from now, we are going to see trillions of dollars of new investment if we can get around these bottlenecks, right? So we have the technology, we've got the capital markets, we have the workforce, but we still have not solved for this problem. And I mean, the toughest way to understand this is if you build a great new clean power project, lovely, you might have to wait 5 years in order to have permission to connect it to the power grid because there are so many projects in the queue. Very unsatisfying to build a major electric generating source and not be able to actually connect it to the power grid, right? So this is not a trivial problem, right? We actually have a step change problem when it comes to achieving that transition. And I think I pick up what Mike said. I think 2015 was the beginning of this kind of broader coalition. The 2020 Energy Act, which doesn't get nearly enough credit, which was what Senator Manchin and Murkowski put together, that basically articulated this whole innovation-driven vision, that was really the playbook that we funded with the IRA. And so I think the last thing I will say is Republicans are appropriately really frustrated with reconciliation, just like Democrats were over the Trump tax cuts. About 90% of the investment is going into red states. So quietly, like we're not trying to make them uncomfortable with this, but they actually kind of love the IRA. We just have to make it boring, right? So like when it got put on the chopping block, we got a lot of apology calls from people saying, look, don't worry, this is just a negotiating. We got a member of Congress said, we just have to roll the grenade across to the White House. The fact that it was never seriously actually negotiated, I mean, there was not a single serious conversation where the basic core clean energy tax credits were on the table. And so we actually think that this thing has just got to kind of sink in. And when we're talking about millions of jobs, regardless of the awkwardness, I mean, not a lot of Democrats didn't take advantage of the tax cuts, despite the fact they didn't like the Trump tax bill. We think the same story is going to basically hold when it comes to what happens next on these clean energy tax credits.
Yeah, I think in 5 years, if we're successful and do this well, we're going to see more virtual power plants. We're going to see far more demand response. We're going to see grid interactive buildings. We're still going to see permitting for new projects, but we're going to see the kind of permitting that I think is smart. The reality is we'll see more jobs because 40% of the jobs in the energy industry are efficiency jobs. So we're going to see jobs if we do this well because efficiency already carries 40%. Our jobs are in 99.8% of the counties in the United States.
Wow.
That means we're everywhere.
Who are
That
those poor
means
suckers that don't have a single job?
that means because there's no people who lives there and there's no buildings, right? So that's really what it is.
We need
right?
more humans.
Right, and so
Got it.
that's what you will see, though. You will see thriving small businesses in communities that you've never seen businesses in. You will see poor communities that will have updated buildings that will all of a sudden bring far more economic growth. You will see more pipelines where we need pipelines. We will see transmission where we need transmission. But I will just, my statement is you start with efficiency, and that's when you impact people in a real meaningful way that they are going to see every single day in their pocketbook and in terms of their environment as well. And then you start building for the future that we need and that we promised.
Sean, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you know, with the transmission issue. I think one thing you're really going to see in the next 5 years is you're going to see existing coal plants that are either coming down or been taken down where the infrastructure is already there. You're going to see small modular reactors and advanced reactors where the transmission's already in place.
Yeah.
And that's going to save whole communities who are built around those coal facilities and the jobs that go with it. So the other big thing I think that people miss is, you know, this permitting reform is awfully important to the goal of bringing back manufacturing in the United States. So it was important to many of the lead investors in the chip business that we get some of these reforms done. So I think it'll move that quicker, create those jobs, and again, there's those operations, whether it's in a refinery or you know, in a wind operation. Middle-class family-sustaining jobs is what this country has strived for the last 50 years. And these investments on the private side are creating these middle-class family-sustaining jobs, and they're really the ones we need. First, we build them, and then we operate those facilities and produce that product.
All right, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining this conversation on permitting reform. It's time to go see if this thing will get passed. Well, not for another 12 hours, until the market's closed. Big thank you to API for partnering with us on this to make this conversation possible, and thanks to all of you for joining this event. Standing room only. I'm not going to take credit at all for that, actually, but very cool to see everybody here. We have a bunch more events this month, so check out the event hub at punchbowl.news and have a wonderful day.